Race war in high school. The 10-year destruction of Franklin K. Lane High School in Brooklyn. Harold Saltzman. Chapter 3. A Court Case and More Crises.
In February 1969, it was not expected that the single session and the reduction of the student body would be a panacea for all the school's ills. 10 years of prolonged neglect could not be overcome with a simple administrative shift. But as a result of the Syracuse affair, and the public outcry which ensued, the UFT chapter was successful, at least, in setting forth minimal safety conditions under which teachers would teach and children learn. The chapter had been forced into assuming a leadership role, a role the school administration and board officials had refused to play. With it went the responsibility of bearing the criticism for the consequences of its action. The faculty had brought to the public's attention for the first time that which educational officials had always kept well hidden. In carrying that burden, Lane's teachers were compelled to suffer intolerable abuse. They were accosted from the left and from the right. Having adopted a middle ground position of favoring integration and opposing the black militants, the teachers had alienated both extremes. The aftermath of the January anarchy was to take on added dimensions as the school year dragged on. During the 3-day shutdown, January 22 to 24, which followed the burning, the school administration worked to reduce the size of the student body to the 4,350 figure which could be accommodated on a single session. Selub and his assistants, Cohen and Tadero, had decided to utilize the services of the Bureau of Attendance to bring about the reduction. Truants who were over the age of 17 were discharged. Those under 17 were referred to the Attendance Bureau with the expectation that those wishing to continue their education could do so at some other high school as assigned by the Office of Central Placement. In all cases, letters were sent to parents asking them to appear at the school if they wanted their children kept on the rolls. Few came. Practically all of the 678 youngsters who were thus removed from the rolls fell into either of two groupings. One category of students was known in the jargon as ghosts. These were youngsters who were officially on the school register but had disappeared with neither the school nor the attendance bureau able to locate them. The other group was referred to as the drop-ins, youngsters who would come to school for a few days and then stay out for weeks, sometimes even months, at a time. There were so many in this category who repeated the truancy pattern several times in the course of a semester that it was impossible for the school to keep tabs on them or to provide the kind of special services they required. The drop-ins were an especially troublesome group because when they did come they only attended some of their classes and for most of the day roamed the building, often creating turmoil. The fact that they were in school so infrequently made the problem doubly difficult since they were, for all practical purposes, anonymous. That anonymity prevented the school from either helping them or protecting the rest of the student body from their dangerous behavior. It didn't take long for the anti-UFT forces to get themselves together into what they called an SOS, Save Our Students, committee. The anti-poverty agencies, operating with federal funds, saw the reduction of the student body as a plot to rid the school of black students. The local agencies of Brownsville and East New York called for a mass rally at their headquarters a week after the terms of the January 21 agreement were disclosed. They flooded the black community with flyers which read,
"Have your son or daughter been transferred from Lane? The UFT is trying to get rid of all black and Puerto Rican students at Franklin Lane. Stop illegal transfers now. Organize. Save our students."
During the next several weeks a number of things occurred to undo the January 21 agreement. Rushing to the rescue of the transferred students was School Board Vice President Milton Galamison, a black churchman from Bedford-Stuyvesant with a long history of leading school boycotts and of heading up a citywide rump school board. Galamison had been appointed to the de jure board by Lindsay as a result of the 1968 interim decentralization law, which permitted the mayor to stack the board with 4 additional members who would be receptive to his own radical ideas for community control of the schools. Galamison carried on a one-man crusade to find out what had actually taken place on January 21 and who was responsible for the transfers. He argued, and quite correctly, that other schools were far more overcrowded than Lane, and cited some of the most affluent and predominantly white schools which were much more overutilized. Why weren't these schools having difficulty? Galamison wanted to know. The question seemed rhetorical, but to the board vice president the reduction of Lane's register was nothing less than a monstrous purge of black youngsters by the white establishment. It should be noted in passing that Galamison and the other black leaders who were soon to enter the fray had been completely silent during the preceding 3 months of turmoil. Not a single voice had been raised, not an iota of leadership from the responsible black community was exerted to smother the racial fires. The absence of that kind of adult leadership from the black community was one of the great tragedies of Lane's story. Even the prominent black legislators from central Brooklyn who were deeply involved with school matters, Assemblyman Samuel Wright and State Senator Waldaba Stewart, had remained on the sidelines during the conflagration. Galamison wasn't alone in trying to find out what had happened to the 678 transferred students. A number of other black churchmen from a group calling itself the Clergy Vigil attempted to get the names of the transferred students. Led by Calvin Marshall, pastor of the Varick Memorial AME Church in Brooklyn, and a spokesman for militant black ministers, they accused the Central Board of using stalling tactics and of purposely hiding the identity of the transferred youngsters whom they wanted to help. But the big thunder came when Kenneth Clark decided to inject himself directly into the dispute. Clark was the only black member of the Board of Regents, the highest policy-making body for education in New York State. He had written a number of books describing the educational deficiencies in ghetto schools, and as a college professor, City College of New York, had achieved the reputation of expert par excellence in the area of urban education. Clark had taken a rather uncompromising position in recent citywide school disputes, was known to favor a very strong community control bill, and was not among the best friends of the teachers' union. His imposing credentials and broad base of strength made him a feared figure to the city's educational bureaucrats. Clark secured the services of the New York Civil Liberties Union, and as the new semester entered its second month the NYCLU filed suit in federal court in behalf of the 678 transferred students. Citing the 14th Amendment, the suit charged that the students' constitutional rights had been violated since they were denied due process and equal protection of the laws. The suit asked the court to declare the named defendants, Dorr, Donovan, Odely, Celeb, and local attendance coordinator Edwin Dannon, in violation of the Due Process Clause and to order the students readmitted, to issue an injunction against any repetition of such dismissals, to order the school board to provide the dismissed students educational opportunities to compensate for the loss of instruction time since the suspension, and for the board to pay financial damages. The filing of the suit had come about, justifiably, because the board had refused to back up the provisions of the local agreement. Students who had been originally referred to the Bureau of Attendance and wanted to continue their high school education were sent from there to the board's Office of Central Placement. Unfortunately, when they were assigned to other high schools by central placement, the youngsters were denied admission on the grounds that they did not reside in the school's districts. Faced with a revolt by high school principals, many of whom were having their own problems with student unrest, placement director Stanley Kingsley took the easier and less threatening course. He assigned those truants right back to O'Daly's District 19 office, dumping the problem back in a lap that was at least partially responsible for creating it. Neither Donovan nor Kingsley wanted an open fight with the high school principals and the communities they would surely rally if Lane's truants were imposed on their schools. Now it was O'Daly's problem again. Each day more youngsters would show up at her office with a letter from high school placement authorizing their enrollment in one of the District 19 schools over which she had jurisdiction. Thomas Jefferson was the only other academic high school in the district, there were 2 vocational high schools, and it was even more overcrowded than Lane. She would not place the transferred students in Jefferson. With her back to the wall and the board backtracking from the January 21 agreement, O'Daly felt morally released from any responsibility to live up to the accord with the Lane chapter. Her next move was to get the truants readmitted to Lane. In her own mind she thought that by sending a few youngsters back each day she would be absolving herself of any wrongdoing connected with their removal, and with a court case looming she was anxious to cover herself. She hoped to extricate herself from the mess through a private arrangement with Celeb to readmit a few of the truants every day, quietly, hoping that nobody would notice. Mary Cohen, who had not been in on the January 21 agreement and who opposed it from the inception, would be the intermediary through whom Odely's subterfuge would be accomplished. But teachers soon took cognizance of the readmissions and began voicing their protests. The UFT Council, by this time convinced that Celeb and O'Daly had conspired to breach the agreement, quickly resolved that
We deplore those attempts to violate the agreements of January 21 and that we reaffirm our intent to take all necessary steps to assure compliance with the understandings and commitments made to the Lane faculty.
The resolution went on to emphasize Item 3 of the 6-point agreement, which read,
There will be a freeze on new admissions for the remainder of the school year, and no student not included in the original 4,350 maximum student group will be programmed at a later date for Lane High School.
The Celeb-O'Daly turnabout was a bitter pill for the staff to swallow, for the teachers felt they were again being deceived. If this provision could be unilaterally breached, they claimed, then the whole agreement was a sham. With faculty pressure beginning to take form, the chapter leaders notified the principal of their intent to call a press conference and announce the subterfuge. As O'Daly groped for a way out, the mayor's office was more than helpful. Cutting through red tape that would normally stall progress for months, Dick Strider of the school task force got clearance from the fire and buildings departments in a matter of days, authorizing the utilization of rooms in a local church as an annex for the returning truants. The Arlington Avenue Presbyterian Church in Cypress Hills was located about a mile from Lane. School and city officials were hoping that the use of the leased space in the church for special classes for truants who wanted to return would satisfy the Galamus and Clark NYCLU forces. It didn't. Shortly before the actual filing of the lawsuit, students were being admitted to the new church annex where 4 classrooms had been refurbished and supplied with teachers, a guidance counselor, and all necessary materials. The annex arrangement, while meeting with the approval of the staff, Celeb, O'Daly, et al., didn't satisfy the Civil Liberties Union, and the suit was filed in federal court in Brooklyn. Several days later, on March 5, Assistant Superintendent Irving Anker came to Lane as Donovan's emissary to try to get the chapter to back off from Point 3 and let the truants return without raising a public clamor. Joining Anker at the meeting were Celeb, Cohen and Tadaro, O'Daly, and Kingsley of Central Placement. Also present was J. David Love. Anker, who a year later was elevated to the post of acting superintendent of schools, came with the hope of convincing a general faculty committee, to be handpicked by Celeb, that the chapter's position on the readmissions issue was self-defeating, and to try to compel me to accept the school board's non-compliance. But Donovan had sent his man with nothing to offer as an inducement, and it was clear that the last thing the union chapter would do was keep silent. After I had convinced Anker that an end run around the UFT couldn't be pulled off, I was called into the meeting. Copies of the January 21 agreement were already on the table as various expressions were put forth concerning the administrative difficulties involved with Point 3. I maintained that the integrity of the agreement presupposed the fundamental honor of all parties and their willingness to abide by their commitments, and that under no circumstances could we accept a unilateral approach to arbitrarily terminate any aspect of the agreement. I had hinted that we would certainly be flexible if there was some assurance that a special educational program could be brought into the school in a single session maintained for the next school year. But Anker didn't bite. He was either unable or unwilling to commit himself to any such innovative project. By the end of the meeting, the only points of general understanding were that the students who were readmitted would be programmed for the Arlington Annex only, that there would be no further readmissions until the Annex program became fully operative, and that the 87 students referred to the district office by Kingsley would be assigned to the Annex. Irving Anker returned to his office at 110 Livingston Street and drafted a memorandum to Donovan and his immediate superior Nathan Brown, entitled,
The Franklin K. Lane Situation, Threat by UFT Chapter Chairman, Mr. Saltzman, that the UFT chapter was planning a press conference to charge the Office of the Superintendent of Schools and the Office of the Mayor with failing to comply with the understanding arrived at with the chapter in January.
The 2-page memorandum reported on the current status of the transferred students.
of the hundreds of students who have been on the suspense register since last term at Lane,
Anchor reported.
and who have been followed up by the Bureau of Attendance, only 138 have been referred to high school placement for further interviewing and placement. Of this number, only 81 have been referred to Mrs. O'Daly's office, and Mr. Saltzman seemed to be reassured and indicated no further plans for public confrontation.
What had been initiated as an emergency administrative change soon attracted the attention of other groups. On March 19, the Citizens Committee for Children released a statement presented at a public meeting of the school board, stating,
We asked for a meeting to discuss what was happening at Franklin K. Lane High School, where children were being removed from school by illegal procedures. And your proposal for temporary annexes certainly does not answer it. No youngster should ever be removed from a regular classroom or a regular school without a fair hearing where he has the right to present his side.
Such was the confusion about what had happened, nobody being quite sure who had done what and under whose authority. During those months of March and April, practically all of Celeb's time was taken up in preparation for the court case. The school board's defense was handled by the city's corporation counsel. From the outset, the strategy of the defense was not to prove it had acted within the purview of its powers, but to try, instead, to work out an accommodation that would be acceptable to the civil liberties attorneys. After weeks of testimony, to which no UFT representative was called by either the plaintiffs or the defense, Judge Jack B. Weinstein of the United States District Court, Brooklyn, issued an interim ruling based on a show of good faith by the defendants. The judge noted in his findings that Celeb and O'Daly
were responding to the orders of superiors and to pressures beyond their control in making the decision which led to the denial of plaintiffs' constitutional rights.
Weinstein went on to rule that the transferred students had, in fact, been denied their rights of due process. The case was left open pending the implementation of the remediation and compensatory education plan put forth by Celeb and O'Daly. The outcome of the court case was a severe setback for the Lane staff in terms of their long-range goals. Although less than half of the truants ever actually returned, and with most of those dropping out again on their own volition shortly thereafter, what was important was that it gave the board justification to invalidate the other provisions of the agreement and return Lane to the status quo. In future talks with the union, both centrally and locally, board officials would hold the UFT responsible for subjecting it to the embarrassment of a well-publicized court case. Even the promises to give Lane special consideration in the pending rezoning of Brooklyn high schools could now be broken. They were. Another result of the court case was the fact that those groups which had rallied to the defense of the transferred students were also successful in ramming through the state legislature in the final days of the 1969 session an amendment to the education law giving suspended students the right of legal representation at suspense hearings, limiting to 5 days the amount of time a principal could suspend a student, and preventing a principal from suspending the same student more than twice. The new legislation forced the board to modify its own policies on suspense procedures, and its revisions adopted in the fall of 1969 made student suspense cases almost as legalistic as a jury trial. The net result was that high schools such as Lane became havens for politically motivated disruptors, junkies, and drug pushers. Few voices were raised against either the new legislation or the board's directive implementing it. Even the UFT was silent, but experienced schoolmen knew that this was but another political step toward the slow and methodical destruction of public education in New York. The school board decided to do nothing about the new suspense law that spring, and without direction from the top, many district superintendents refused to process cases regardless of the infraction for fear of unknowingly violating the new law. Elizabeth O'Daly's resentment against the union in general and me in particular had reached new heights with the court case. She blamed the union for getting her into that legal predicament, and now with the new state law she arbitrarily decreed that there would be no more suspense cases brought to her office. The situation became ludicrous when she ordered Celeb to retain one particular youngster with a long police record who had been suspended for the 5-day maximum period for having assaulted a teacher. Within the school administration, opinion was unanimous that this youngster was a menace and that his presence in school constituted a very real danger to students and teachers. Challenging O'Daly's refusal to support Celeb's efforts to remove the student, the UFT chapter wrote,
Who will bear the responsibility if this youngster, or any of the others you refuse to see, commits an act that results in an unspeakable tragedy?
2 weeks earlier there had been another outbreak of the racial violence which had continued on and off all during the spring term, and it was noted that the most recent round coincided with O'Daly's lifting of the suspense of militants who had been excluded from school and or arrested for leading a riot the week before. In this most recent outburst on May 9, black and white youths clashed in the cafeteria and a number of fires were set. In criticizing O'Daly for having overridden Celeb's suspense order after 5 days, I issued a statement to the press, saying, "The district superintendent, O'Daly, apparently felt that the health and safety of 4,300 students was unimportant. How does anybody expect to see an end to violence when administrators at all levels are engaged in wholesale coddling of student militants? You are never going to have peace in the high schools as long as local school and district officials refuse to deal with terrorism by quasi-criminal elements." O'Daly's reaction was immediate and intense. For 2 years she had resented the growing influence of the union and what she viewed as its encroachments into areas such as community relations, which had traditionally been left as the exclusive domain of the district head. She had sincerely tried, she believed, to establish and maintain a workable relationship with the UFT. But my having exposed her to public ridicule was more than she could tolerate. On May 13 she decided to break off all relations with the UFT, except for the grievance procedure which was mandated by the citywide contract, and she wrote to the chapter chairman in the district's 31 schools.
In recent weeks your district chairman, Mr. Harold Saltzman, has resorted to several unjustified personal attacks against me in the newspapers. I find it impossible to continue my attempts to cooperate under these circumstances.
The matter of suspense procedures was not settled in the spring of 1969. The militants continued to wreak havoc in the school. The cadres of disaffected blacks whom they continued to turn on and off kept the fires of hatred and bigotry burning. Few newspaper accounts addressed the naked horrors being enacted at Lane and at a score of other city schools. But at about the same time as the New York State Legislature was guaranteeing, de facto, the right of racists to turn the public schools into battlegrounds, Joseph Alsop, a nationally syndicated columnist, visited New York's high schools and wrote his own observation of the drama that was unfolding.
What is going on, in plain truth, is nothing more or less than an attempt to take over the New York City schools by far-out extremists, both black and white. Their tools are hot-headed kids in most schools, a small minority, and those people in the black community, again a small minority, whom the black extremists can lead by the nose. Community control is the slogan, extremists' control is the aim, and behind this aim is the larger purpose of using the schools for propaganda and indoctrination, including black racist propaganda that might embarrass the Ku Klux Klan. And if all this goes on and gets worse as seems likely, some very hard choices will unavoidably have to be made.
But 1969 was a year when few dared to speak out against the terror for fear of being given a racist label at worst, at best being tagged a reactionary in an era of sweeping change. To expose bigotry was to be a bigot. Nor were our political institutions healthy in this climate of fear. It had been traditional at Lane for there to be assembly programs at election time in which student speakers would debate in support of the different candidates. But 1969 was a year when political differences couldn't be honestly and openly expressed in a social studies classroom, much less a school auditorium in front of 1,000 students. While most white teachers and students favored the Democratic candidate, Mario Procaccino, over incumbent John Lindsay in the mayoralty race, most kept their preference well concealed. The Comptroller's Law and Order campaign had been interpreted in the ghetto as being aimed directly at the black community, and the black students of Lane equated support of Procaccino with racism. There could be no political discussions at Lane when teachers and students were afraid to talk about the candidates and issues. Perhaps Rabbi Meir Kahane, head of the Jewish Defense League, a militant group that sprung up during the 1968 school strike in reaction to black antisemitism, best described the fear paralysis. He was writing about the takeover at Cornell University by rifle-toting black militants, an act which shocked the nation. But the man who saw in Cornell another Weimar, could just as easily have been talking about Lane High School when he said,
For 36 hours, they broke the law while the lemmings who preside over the school also presided over the beginning of its destruction. In grandiose spinelessness, they watched. In magnificent timidity, they did nothing as hoodlums masquerading as oppressed students wreaked their havoc on the building and on the rule of civilization. Blame the student fascists? They are not the major culprits. They are the hoodlums and gangsters parading as aggrieved revolutionaries. But they are not the main culprits. It is the men who allowed this incredible assault on democracy and society who must bear the main brunt of the wrath of every sane and shaken citizen. The unbelievable scene of college officials capitulating, no, more than that, for here was capitulation with degradation. These insulated theoreticians of life fail so miserably to understand the extremist mind, the mind that is immune to compromise, to reason, to the warmth of interpersonal relationships. These gravediggers of the campus fail to realize that the extremist knows no limits, that no concession is meaningful to him, that self-hate and self-destruction drive him to destroy all others with him.
After the smoke had settled from the January disaster, different approaches were taken to reach out to the militants who had destroyed the integrity of a school and along with it the dreams so many had held for an open society. People were going off in different directions searching for the formula that could put the school back together. Not everyone agreed with the basic assumptions of the chapter leadership. For the 20 anti-union teachers who had broken into the school during the 1968 strike, a major cause of the crisis was the union chapter's reactionary posture. They formed a committee of concerned teachers, and 10 of them put their names to a position paper attacking the UFT chapter and offering instead
A constructive analysis of Lane High School.
in which they wrote,
The series of strikes by the UFT in the beginning of this term has produced an unfortunate atmosphere. The series of strikes has caused an increased student alienation and frustration. There has been a history of racial tensions at Lane for many years, including the distribution of anonymous racist and anti-Semitic literature. It has been suggested that communication at Lane between staff and students had broken down. Yet, it is questionable that there was ever any real dialogue at Lane. Communication can only exist in an atmosphere free from fear and intimidation. The act of communication should neither assign blame, nor fear pointing the accusing finger. Without this climate, the facade of communication disintegrates, and all efforts are doomed to failure.
Most of Lane's teachers were angry at the insinuation that they were not concerned about and insensitive to the needs of black youngsters. Most of them had been raised and schooled in the liberal tradition and were deeply committed to progressive goals. Many had been active in the civil rights movement long before it became the in thing. Others had participated in boycotts and other kinds of demonstrations hand in hand with blacks. A great many had established close ties, indeed friendships, with black students. And several had offered their homes as refuge to troubled youngsters and gave financial assistance to students of indigent families. In short, they felt that they had done more for black youngsters, without ever asking for ceremonial credit. How resentful they were at being called unconcerned. One instructor, Jerome Sager, responded to the concerned teachers with an open letter to the faculty, expressing the dedication and frustration of most teachers of inner-city schools who labor under tremendous imposts and often are the scapegoats for cowardly administrators, starving educational systems, and social ills.
To the faculty of Lane High School,
Sager began.
I find myself at this time compelled to express certain feelings which I have until now kept to myself. I am writing this partly because I am just one of many who are content in knowing they have tried their best to do their jobs, but mostly because I did not want to fan the fires of dissension which have arisen in our school and which apparently will continue to burn unless we extinguish them once and for all. I find myself feeling angrier each time I hear someone say to me, "You must have genuine feelings for your students," or, "Your attitude must be improved." I have been teaching at Lane for 7 years now and can sleep well at night knowing that I do a damn good job at school. I, like most of my colleagues, work hard to try to help every student in every way possible. The students that come to school ready and willing to accept the help we offer receive this help from us without the slightest thought of color or religion entering our minds. The effort, preparation, and diligence of our staff is, for the most part, unquestionable. It is for these reasons that I resent being told in any general way that I, as well as others, am not doing my job. What rights does anyone have to imply these things to the press, at faculty meetings, or even at social gatherings? These implications, so vague and general in nature, are accepted as truths by many who hear them. Why must we be forced to defend ourselves against such untruths? We know in our hearts how hard we are trying, we know how much we want our students to excel. These efforts are the things we should be proud of.
In spite of these divisions, teachers with differing points of view did try to come together during the 3-day closing in January by holding workshops on various aspects of the Lane problem. One such workshop was on racism in the school. For 3 days, teachers met to express their views and opinions about what had caused the breakdown. The meetings represented a cross-section of teachers, male and female, liberal and conservative, young and old, union and anti-union, black and white, all searching and blaming. The minutes of one of the workshop sessions, recorded by its secretary, Bruce Noble, provide some insights into varying teacher attitudes. Chairman.
Asked for a definition of racism.
Unidentified woman.
It is discrimination solely on the basis of race.
Mr. L.
Spoke of the history of slavery, of oppressors and oppressed. The oppressor is usually bigoted. Recently, the black man has rebutted that bigotry.
Mr. B.
All of the slaves were black.
Chairman.
What are the general trends of how whites tend to treat blacks, particularly here at Lane? Let's show each other what we're doing.
Mr. B.
There has always been some racial tension in this school and neighborhood. Formerly, there was a black minority in the school, now there is a black majority. But there has always been racism. What is the old Lane?
Mrs. M.
I understand that formerly, it was student versus student, usually in gangs. There were no real racial difficulties between teacher and student.
Mr. G.
We'll never return to the old Lane. Let's talk about Lane today.
Mrs. B.
Cites incidents of discrimination coming from the Board of Education, fact that she was a WASP, and that WASPs have been blamed for problems in the schools. Racism exists in all places, and between whites.
Mr. T.
Perhaps I'm bigoted. Cites incident with black student in the cafeteria. Student resists. White teacher, white dean. Common problem, student feels he's being picked on because he's black. What can we do to stop this now?
Miss K.
One possible solution is having a black dean.
Mr. L.
Police to black people is a dirty name. When the police are white, we should import a black dean, if possible.
Unidentified man.
Color is not important. We've had a black dean. If we didn't have attacks, we wouldn't need police.
Mr. L.
Administration and teachers are at fault to have let the situation disintegrate so that the police were necessary.
Previous speaker voices disagreement.
UFT leadership was also at fault. The building was completely unattended. In the auditorium before the strike, there were 600 kids, 2 teachers.
Much cross-conversation. Mrs. M.
Cites cafeteria, you'll get trouble even with supervision.
Mr. L.
Agrees, but we're approaching a police state. I don't have a solution. We, our society, can do anything we want. Why don't we get together and try?
Chairman.
Many teachers didn't go on building assignments.
Mr. H.
I advocate limited teacher patrols, but women should not be on patrol. Cites incident in hall where girl student grabbed woman aide, 3 men, including a policeman, were needed to control the student. Teachers should not be policemen.
Chairman.
Let's shift away from the issue of police.
Mrs. S.
I was there at the time of the incident. I objected to the approach taken by the aide.
Mr. S.
Let's get back to the Committee on Racism. What happened to the dialogue between teachers and students? What is causing these antisocial acts? What can we do? The concerned teacher's statement emphasized patrol and control. What is really wrong? What can we do?
Mr. B.
As a signer of that statement, we want to approach the whole Lane community. Our statement in part was a response to the UFT's attempts to speak only to Woodhaven Cypress Hills. Also, we should take long-range steps, example, changes in curriculum. We could have more remedial work, materials available for it in my field, social studies. Also, we could have more Black authority figures in the school.
Mr. S.
The UFT is interested in a dialogue with the entire community. In regard to social studies, you can help with their reading.
Mr. B.
I have.
Dubious about the effectiveness of Black authority figures in cutting down teacher antagonisms. Beating people up is an immediate problem.
Mr. P.
Coming back to the topic of racism, says Mr. B, is advocating going back to Black teachers for Black students in Black schools, pre-1954. Our license does not stipulate the race of the students we are qualified to teach. Our license says we should teach, not be policemen. Suggests teachers should help one another when problems arise.
Mr. V.
Times have changed drastically in the last 10 years. The Negro is searching for his identity, white people don't like it. Vietnam protests and college demonstrations have filtered down to high school students. Whites think they can do something to the Negroes to solve the problem. This is a corollary to our antiquated idea of education, what teachers do to students. Most important, students have an identity, teachers tend to talk down to students. We should have a real dialogue with students, especially the troublemakers.
Mr. U.
There has been a rapid social change. A generation gap exists between most students and teachers. This is a white society, it is a white problem. Times have changed from the integrationist period of the early 60s. Now there is a lack of good faith, students lack good faith in teachers. Black teachers frequently command more listening power with Black students than do white teachers. And our students are not unique. Students accept less now, they question things more and more, demand more. It's clear that there are no students here. It takes more and greater visible signs from us for Blacks to accept us as concerned human beings. We should openly demonstrate more faith in students, for example by giving them more power in making school policy.
Mr. O.
I hope we aren't listened to because we're Black or white. Our students will meet all kinds of people in our society. I object to the Lane Reporter editorial, Photostatic Education.
Miss B.
I didn't write the editorial. It's a student newspaper, expressing student opinions. No one has contacted me personally or the staff about the editorial. We have been accused by innuendo.
Chairman.
We're skirting the issue of racism at Lane High School. We should talk about not caring teachers, about excessive concern with academic students compared to general students. We don't look at him, the general student, as a person.
Cries of no, no. Mr. O.
Opinions in this school run the gamut of those in society. We should make our students aware of the diversity of opinions.
Mr. T.
I've been a substitute for 4 years, in many high schools. There has been a difference in approach and attitude on the part of teachers when they give me work. They give me lots of work with academic classes, say do what you want with general classes. This is a generalization. Academic students are mostly white, general students mostly Black. Draw your own conclusions.
Mrs. M.
Is this a racial attitude, or a discrimination based on whether the student is academic or general? Granted, teachers have more regard for academic students. Much cross-conversation.
Mr. G.
The fact that these attitudes exist is important. That is, students do have attitudes toward education, teachers, etc. How can we correct these attitudes? What is our role, here in the classroom, in the halls? Our attention has traditionally been focused more on academic students. Our general and commercial students are primarily Black. The student realizes this, that he is not getting as much attention. What can we do to correct this attitude?
Miss R.
I've seen 20 to 40 studies on general versus academic classes. In one study, 5 black students from general classes were placed randomly in academic classes and they did significantly better than they had before. It is the attitude of the teacher that makes the difference.
Mr. D.
How is this racial?
Miss R.
Most teachers subconsciously assume that these kids can't learn.
Cries of ridiculous, I object, etc.
We teachers fight against this assumption, deny that we have it.
Mr. L.
In Ocean Hill, Brownsville, black kids bussed out to East Flatbush were called unlearnables. This is an example of attitudes throughout the city.
Mr. D.
In the health education department, it's generally accepted that we treat our students equally. Students tend not to think of us as teachers, they talk to us like friends. We get more of that type of relationships. Therefore, we're in a better position when a student-teacher confrontation arises.
Cross-conversation. Chairman.
No cross-conversation, please. Time is running out.
Mrs. G.
What approach does a teacher take to avoid antagonism and confrontation? A barrier does exist.
Chairman.
This is important, let's talk about this.
Mr. B.
Respect for the student is the key, not being polite.
Mrs. T.
I resent this kind of psychological approach, generalizing about attitudes. Have you observed me in my class? Suggests that teachers observe one another in class.
Cries of good idea, etc. The faculty workshops were not the only attempts to provide dialogue and understanding at Lane. There were efforts to reach out to the students, especially to the militants who had been in the forefront of the disruption. One venture in particular was supposed to establish meaningful liaison between students and teachers, and between white and black student leaders. Through the auspices of the National Conference of Christians and Jews and the board's Human Relations Division, a special weekend session was planned for March 7th to 9th for teachers and students to meet in an informal and relaxed atmosphere, away from school. It was hoped that student involvement would help lead to a solution of the racial crisis. Optimistically, school officials had rented a motel in Stony Brook, a quiet suburban community on Long Island, about 50 miles east of the city. It was supposed to be an awakening, an enlightenment, for the 8 teachers and 33 students who participated. It turned out to be a disaster. In charge of the trip was Mary Cohen, representing the school administration, with Ed Kisane, the community relations coordinator, attending for the District 19 office. Friday's plenary session reflected a certain uneasiness, a resistance to open up and discuss frankly the factors that had contributed to the school's problems. It soon became evident why. The militants had elected to use the conference as a point of escalation, and on Saturday they announced to the rest of the group that there was nothing more to talk about. The time for dialogue had long passed, they insisted, and although they were only 8 in number, the militants succeeded in swinging the more moderate blacks to their position. Now constituting a majority bloc, the blacks walked out of the session and for the rest of the weekend isolated themselves from the whites, refusing to associate with them. The white youngsters who were genuinely concerned, and who had come with open minds willing to listen and to cooperate, found themselves shut off with nobody to talk to. But the militants weren't satisfied with their sabotage of an honest attempt to open up an avenue of communication between the races and generations. They were going further. Meeting in secrecy, they drafted a list of 10 demands, which they called non-negotiable, and presented them to Mary Cohen with an ultimatum that unless the administration met the demands within 2 weeks there would be hell to pay at Lane on March 24. The demands were not very much different from those which had been drafted and presented to the school board by various citywide student groups, see page 201, such as the High School Student Union, an SDS counterpart, and the Afro-American Students Association. The latter was the group with which Lane's militants were aligned. There wasn't much for the white students to do that weekend. They were a minority to begin with, and now there was only that feeling of helplessness. Several of them felt threatened by the hostile mood created by the militants, and they called home. On Saturday evening and Sunday morning a number of white parents made the drive out from the city to take their youngsters home and spare them further psychological abuse. The actual demands were not brought to the attention of the faculty until March 17, by way of a flyer issued in school by the militants, reiterating their demands and exclaiming,
These demands are non-negotiable and must be met within the 2-week period exclusive of Monday, March 10, 1969. Monday, March 24 is Black Monday.
Exactly what was supposed to happen on Black Monday remained a secret, but fears and anxiety ran high as the week of March 17 opened. Saltzman called a faculty conference that day and presented the staff with copies of the demands, asking that they be used as a basis for the discussion. It was unclear to the faculty what the principal's response had been up to that point, and teachers were noticeably concerned about the possibility of renewed violence on Black Monday. Had the police been notified? Had the superintendent of schools been apprised? Was the mayor's assistance requested? Had the militants been told they would be held responsible for any damage to persons or property? Had the parents of the leaders been contacted? What local agencies from the black community were being sought for help? Had the Parents' Association been called in? Where was Odely and the local school board? Had a timetable of conferences been established for the remainder of the week to try to resolve the issues? What, in short, the teachers wanted to know, was the administration doing to head off another explosion? Saltzman had employed the strategy of underplaying the demands and the threat of Black Monday, hoping to avoid publicity and gambling that the pending rebellion would peter out. He held several meetings with the militants during the 2-week period, but nothing was resolved. If the principal needed any reminder that he was again the man on the spot, a group of black students gave it to him as he opened the faculty conference on March 17. Sticking their heads in from the rear of the auditorium, several students screamed, "You got one more week, Morty." The militants distributed some of the most frightening literature during that week prior to Black Monday.
A majority of students in Lane High School are black.
One flyer said, and
The administration is bullshitting with the education of the black students at Lane. The teachers are totally racist.
Flyers showing a coffin entitled Lane High School called upon black students to wear black armbands on March 24 to mourn the death of Lane. It was psychological warfare masterfully waged by the architects of disruption. Even if nothing happened on March 24, they had won a stunning victory, outfoxing the administration and causing further polarization. More than 100 policemen were on duty in and around Lane on Black Monday. They had erected barricades along the 100-yard stretch from Jamaica Avenue, the main street, all along Dexter Court where the student entrance is located. All traffic on the 3 side street approaches to the school was blocked off. Black Monday had been given wide publicity in the local press, and the city wasn't taking any chances. But the fear of violence kept most of the 4,300 students home. Robert "Sonny" Carson, former head of Brooklyn Corps, and an adult who had become closely identified with Lane's militants, appeared at the school with his coterie of bearded self-proclaimed revolutionaries and tried to gain entrance into the building. But the city was determined to prevent violence on this day, and Carson was turned back. After registering his vociferous objections, he left quietly, followed down Dexter Court by 3 policemen. Black Monday had come and passed with no outbursts, no demonstrations, no violence. But the barricades stayed in place for the remainder of the week, and the heavy police guard continued. It was a day that engendered a fear in the white community that would linger for some time.